The moment the lawyer's voice boomed across the room, it felt like the world stopped spinning. He called my brothers, Graham and Dean, to the front. They went with this smug grin on their faces, ready to claim what they thought was theirs. My mother, Genevieve, had just died, and the will reading was her final act of control. I was sitting in the back, invisible as usual. That's when the lawyer got to my name. Wyatt Campbell. He cleared his throat and said, "To my son, Wyatt. I leave the contents of the locked chest in the West Wing library." The air left my lungs. My brothers burst out laughing. It wasn't a quiet chuckle. It was a loud, mocking, victorious sound that echoed through the entire room. They knew. They all knew. They had just inherited a combined $18 million, and I got a piece of furniture. If you've ever felt like your own family has betrayed you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. This story is for anyone who's been told they're not good enough by the people who were supposed to love them the most. And if you want to see how I went from getting nothing to getting everything, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, what was in that chest changed my entire life. The laughter died down, but the humiliation lingered, a thick, suffocating cloud. I didn't look at anyone. I just stared at my hands, balled into fists in my lap. My father, Elias Thorne, died 10 years ago, and I often wondered if he'd be disappointed in me, a man who couldn't even command respect from his own family. But the truth is, this wasn't about respect. This was about power, and my mother had just shown everyone who had it. She had always made it clear that her sons were a legacy, and I was an afterthought. Graham, the golden boy, was the CEO of her real estate empire, a natural-born shark. Dean was the perfect second in command, just as ruthless but with a flashier smile. They were her creations, her masterpieces. I was just the dusty old piece of wood in the corner that she forgot to throw out. Growing up, the only place I felt truly seen was in my workshop. The smell of sawdust and fresh-cut pine was my comfort. It was where I could create things with my hands, where I could turn nothing into something beautiful. My parents hated it. They saw it as a pointless hobby, a waste of potential. Real men build empires, not birdhouses. "Wyatt," my mother would say, her voice as sharp as a newly sharpened blade. She wanted me to be like them, to live and breathe the world of high-stakes real estate. To her, it was all about the numbers, the deals, the constant grind of making more money. But I was never wired that way. My heart beat for the feel of the wood grain, the quiet satisfaction of a perfect dovetail joint. It was a language she never understood. This divide between us was so deep, so fundamental, that I wonder now if it was what she was trying to prove with that locked chest. A final lesson in my own inadequacy, delivered for all the world to see. I finally managed to stand, my legs feeling like lead. I walked over to the lawyer, Mr. Finch, who handed me a key. He looked at me with an odd mix of pity and discomfort. "I'm sorry." "Wyatt," he murmured, but his eyes said, "This is how your mother wanted it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. I could feel my brother's eyes on me as I walked out, probably waiting for me to break down, but I didn't. I just got in my old pickup truck and drove back to my small apartment, the key burning a hole in my pocket. The anger was a slow burn, turning my stomach into a knot. I thought about the words my mother had just spoken through her lawyer, and they resonated with every single moment of my life. My father's death was a turning point for me. I thought maybe it would soften her. Maybe she'd see the importance of family, but it only made her more driven, more ruthless. My brothers followed suit, seeing her as the perfect example of success, and I was left behind, a ghost in my own family, a man who felt more at home in a pile of sawdust than in his mother's $1 million mansion. The $18 million they stole was just a number, What they had really stolen was my dignity, my place, and my peace. But little did any of them know, that little key was about to unlock a truth that would change everything. The chest was locked for a reason, and I was about to find out why. It didn't start with a will, or a locked chest, or a cold voice in a lawyer's office. It started a long time ago, with a boy who just wanted to belong. Growing up, our house was a stage. Graham and Dean were the stars, and I was the stagehand, the one who moved the props and stood in the shadows. We had a pool, a tennis court, a perfectly manicured lawn, but it always felt like a hotel. Every space had a purpose, and I never really found mine. My brothers were always praised for their business sense. Graham, the oldest, was a natural leader, sharp and commanding. He'd organize neighborhood lemonade stands and somehow end the day with a profit that would make my dad proud. Dean, the middle child, was the smooth talker. He could convince our mom that a broken window was an act of God, not his misplaced baseball. They were the ones who sat with my dad, Elias Thorne, on the weekends, learning about market trends and investment portfolios. I was the one who was always in the garage, building things out of scrap wood. I remember once, when I was 10, I spent an entire month building a birdhouse. It was a masterpiece. At least to me. I painted it bright blue and white. With a tiny front porch, I carried it into the living room, so proud, hoping for a single word of praise from my mom. She glanced up from her magazine, her eyes barely meeting mine. Wyatt, really, a birdhouse? When are you going to start thinking about your future? The words weren't a question. They were a judgment. She saw my passion as a weakness, a distraction from the only thing that mattered to her success. My dad, Elias, was a complicated man. He was an artist at heart, a brilliant painter who gave it all up for my mom's business. He was the only one who ever really understood me. He'd sneak into the garage sometimes, just to watch me work. He'd never say much, just watch, and a soft, sad smile would cross his face. It was a silent language we shared, a bond built on the shared understanding of being out of place in our own home. My brothers would mock me for it. Wyatt's in his wood cave again, they'd sneer. Playing with toys. My mother never corrected them. To her, it was just the truth. She wanted her sons to be extensions of her, to carry on her legacy of ambition and wealth. She was a self-made woman, and she was ruthless about it. She believed in earning every inch of ground, every dollar, and in her world, creativity and passion were just liabilities. They didn't produce a profit. They didn't build an empire. I remember the day my dad passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack at his desk. I was the one who found him. He had a pencil in his hand and a drawing of a simple wooden chair on the paper in front of him. It was a detail my mother and brothers missed, or didn't care to notice. For them, his death was a business opportunity. They fought over his assets and his place in the company. For me, it was the loss of the only person who ever saw me. I remember sitting in the garage for hours after the funeral, just staring at the chair drawing. It was like a final message to me, a quiet reminder of what truly mattered. My brothers were so focused on the material things he left behind, they couldn't see the real legacy he tried to pass down. My mom's relationship with my brothers, Graham and Dean, was a strange, silent contract. She saw them as the rightful heirs, the ones who would carry the family name to even greater heights. It was a partnership based on greed and ambition, not love. They understood her language perfectly, the language of deals, of acquisitions, of power. She would light up when Graham talked about a new acquisition, her eyes gleaming with a pride she never showed me. When Dean landed a big client, she'd pat him on the back and toast to his success. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, and I was always standing in the wings, forgotten. I always wondered what it would feel like to have that kind of connection with her, to be a part of their world. But deep down, I knew I never could be. I wasn't made of the same cold, calculating stuff they were. My hands were meant for wood, not for money. My heart was meant for creating, not for taking. And in her eyes, that made me a failure. You know what it makes me wonder? Have you ever been the odd one out in your own family, the one who just didn't fit? Comment and let me know. Screaming at the top of my lungs wouldn't have changed a thing. You can't argue with a brick wall. And my mother and brothers were solid granite when it came to their business. After my dad died, the family dynamic shifted from distant to downright hostile. My mom, Genevieve, took over the entire company, and Graham and Dean became her loyal henchmen. They'd sit around the dinner table talking about square footage and market capitalization like it was a language I'd never learned. I was invisible. A ghost in my own home. One day, I decided to try. I approached my mom and asked if I could join the family business. Not as a leader, but just to help out. I told her I wanted to show her I was more than just a guy who played with wood. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes like chips of ice. "Wyatt," she said, "you don't have a head for numbers, but you can be useful." And that was it. She put me on the property management team, dealing with all the forgotten, run-down lots they owned. It was basically a glorified janitor's job, but I saw it as a chance to prove myself. It was hard work. I was out there in the heat of the Florida sun, pulling weeds and fixing fences, while my brothers were in air-conditioned offices, closing deals. But I found something. I was managing this huge plot of land, a forgotten swampy area, and I noticed something odd about the soil. It was rich, dark, and loamy. I'd seen land like this before, but always in pictures, in books about growing tropical plants and trees. I took a few samples home, and they came back perfect. I realized the lot, which they had written off as worthless, was prime for growing rare and valuable mahogany. A light bulb went off in my head. This wasn't just a worthless patch of dirt. It was a gold mine. I spent weeks putting together a proposal, researching the market, calculating potential profits, and sketching out plans for a sustainable lumber business. This was my chance, my time to shine. I walked into my mother's office, my hands shaking as I held the binder. She didn't look up from her computer. "What is it?" "Wyatt," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. I laid the binder on her desk. "I found something. Mom, this land, it's perfect for growing mahogany. We could build a sustainable business. A new legacy." She barely glanced at it. Dean walked in then, holding a bottle of champagne. "Big day, Mom. Just finalized the deal on the new high-rise. We're going to break ground next month." He saw my binder on the desk and smirked. My mother's face lit up. She put an arm around Dean and beamed. "That's my boy. That's a real legacy." I tried again. "Mom, just look at it. This could be huge." She waved a dismissive hand. "Wyatt, I don't have time for your little projects. Put it on Dean's desk. He can handle it." My stomach dropped. She wasn't just dismissing my idea. She was handing it over to the person who would take all the credit. I didn't say another word. I just walked out of her office, the binder still on Dean's desk, and felt a cold fury building inside me. I was being used, and they didn't even care enough to hide it. I watched from a distance as Dean and Graham flipped through my proposal, their faces a mixture of surprise and greed. They saw the numbers, the potential profits, the exact same thing I had, but they saw it as a transaction, not a passion. I was a tool to them, a means to an end. It was the moment I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, I would never get the credit. They were the ones in the light, and I was always in the shadows. This wasn't just about business. It was about control. My mom, Genevieve wanted to control every aspect of my life, even my passion. But I didn't know then that this act of betrayal would lead to the biggest, most shocking discovery of my life. After my mahogany proposal got tossed aside like yesterday's trash, I did what I always did. I went back to my workshop. The smell of sawdust was the only thing that could ground me. I just needed to be alone with my tools, to build something real, something they couldn't take from me. But the peace didn't last long. A few weeks later, a huge headline in the local paper screamed, "Sinclair Brothers secure Palm Beach's largest land deal, the Mahogany Project." It was my proposal, my numbers, my idea. My brothers, Graham and Dean, were standing in front of a giant banner with their faces on it, beaming. Dean was being interviewed, his voice full of the kind of bravado that makes your skin crawl. "We saw the potential in this forgotten lot," he said. "It's all about vision, really. Something you're either born with or you're not." I could feel the blood rush to my face. The subtle jab was meant for me. I decided to confront them. I drove to the main office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. When I walked in, they were celebrating, champagne flutes in hand. My mother, Genevieve, was there, laughing and talking with investors. She saw me, her smile faltering for a second before hardening. "Wyatt," she said, her voice flat. "This is a private celebration." I ignored her and walked right up to my brothers. "That was my idea," I said, my voice low and shaking. Graham just looked at me, a blank expression on his face. "What was your idea, Wyatt?" he asked, as if he genuinely couldn't remember. "The Mahogany Project. The numbers, the plan, the whole concept. It was all in the binder I gave Mom." Dean laughed. "Oh, that old thing. It was a nice little piece of fiction. Wyatt, we gave it to our interns to clean up for us. I'm glad you're finally thinking like a businessman, even if it's a little simplistic." I looked at my mother, searching for a single hint of remorse, a sliver of humanity. Nothing. She just stared at me, her eyes saying what she wouldn't. "You don't belong here. You never have." The cold truth of it hit me like a physical blow. They had used me. My hard work, my passion, my hope, it was all just a means to an end for them. I wasn't just a disappointment. I was a pawn. My own family had betrayed me, not just by stealing my idea, but by pretending they didn't even know what I was talking about. They were experts at gaslighting me, at making me feel crazy for even thinking I had a place in their world. "You know what?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You can have it. You can have the project, the money, the credit. I don't want it." Graham just shrugged. "That's probably for the best. Little brother, you're not cut out for this world anyway." As he spoke those words, I felt something in me snap. A lifetime of being told I wasn't good enough, of being cast aside, of being made to feel small. It all came crashing down on me in that moment. The betrayal was so complete, so total, that it left no room for hope. I turned and walked out, leaving the sound of their laughter and clinking glasses behind. I thought that was the end of it, the lowest I could possibly go. I thought I had nothing left to lose. But I didn't know that my mother's final act of cruelty that locked chest was waiting for me back home, and that it would unlock a secret far more devastating than any family betrayal. Walking out of my brother's celebration, the taste of their victory was bitter on my tongue. I got in my truck, but I didn't drive away right away. I just sat there, my hands still white from clenching the steering wheel. I could see them through the window, my mother smiling, my brothers laughing, toasting their triumph. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a complete and total invalidation of my entire life. Every ounce of hope I had held on to, every last bit of me that wanted to be a part of their world, just crumbled away. I felt empty, lighter, in a way, like I had finally shed a weight I'd been carrying my whole life. The weight of trying to be someone I wasn't. I drove home to my apartment, a tiny one-bedroom above my workshop. The place was a mess of wood shavings and half-finished projects. But it was mine. It was real. I sat on my couch, the key to the chest still in my pocket, and stared at the key. It was a plain, old-fashioned brass key, worn smooth from years of being handled. I'd almost forgotten it. It felt so insignificant, so worthless, just like my mother had intended. But a small part of me, that stubborn, hopeful part, wondered if there was more to it. I thought about the way she looked at me when she gave it to me. There was no love, no kindness, but there was something, a look of finality, a look that said, "This is it. This is your life." I knew I had to go back to the mansion. I had to see what was in that chest. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final word from a mother who had never had a kind one for me. I drove back to the house, a sprawling, imposing structure that had always felt more like a museum than a home. The gate was unlocked, and I let myself in. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the windows. I found my way to the library, a room I had been in 1,000 times but had never really seen. It was filled with mahogany bookshelves, a huge stone fireplace, and a massive desk. The chest was sitting on top of the desk, looking small and insignificant in the cavernous room. I stood in front of it for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. What was I expecting, old photos? A handwritten letter? I had no idea. But I knew that whatever was in there, it was meant for me and me alone. I took a deep breath, pulled the key from my pocket, and slid it into the lock. It clicked, and the heavy lid creaked open. Inside, it wasn't old clothes or musty papers. It was a single, worn, leather-bound book. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded. But I could make out the words. It was a diary. My father's diary. I sat down in the big leather chair, the book heavy in my hands. The first entry was dated 25 years ago, the year I was born. I've been thinking about what to do. My father wrote, "Genevieve is pushing me to give up my business, to merge our companies. But I can't. Not when I know what she's done. I can't leave her. Not now. I have to protect him. He's so small, so innocent. I can't let her win." I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the words. My father had been a man of immense wealth and power, but he had given it all up for my mother. He had sold his company, a flourishing construction and real estate firm, to her, for a single dollar. He had done it to protect me. He had done it to protect my inheritance. The diary was a story of a man who had sacrificed everything for his son, a man who had been a ghost in his own home, just like me. He had been a prisoner, a slave to my mother's ambition. He had seen the darkness in her, the cold, calculating greed. He had known that she would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. He had given up his life, his business, his passion, just to protect me. I kept reading, a slow, painful burn building in my chest. He wrote about my birth, my first steps, my first words. He wrote about the way my hands would instinctively reach for wood, the way I would spend hours in the garage, building things. He saw it all. He had seen me, truly seen me, in a way my mother never had. But he also wrote about her. He wrote about her ruthless ambition, her obsession with power, her disdain for anything that didn't have a dollar sign attached to it. He wrote about the night she had found his diary and had threatened to burn it. He had hidden it, knowing that one day I would find it. He had been so sure, so certain. He had believed that I would find the truth. I finished the diary, my hands shaking. I had so many questions. Why had he left me? Why had he let her win? Why had he not just told me the truth? I looked up at the moon, shining through the window, and I knew the answer. He had been a coward. He had been a prisoner. But he had also been a loving father. He had been a man who had loved me more than anything in the world. And he had been a man who had been betrayed. I closed the diary and walked out of the library, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a ghost. I was a man who had been given a mission. I was a man who had been given a truth. I was going to find out what had happened to my father. I was going to find out who my real mother was. I was going to find out what my mother, Genevieve, had done. And I was going to get my life back. The $18 million they had stolen was just a number. The truth was priceless. I was going to find it. I was going to find justice. I was going to find myself. Finding that diary was like a bomb going off in my brain. It was proof. Not just that my mom had been cold and cruel, but that she was a thief, a liar, a betrayer of the highest order. My father, Elias Thorne, hadn't just died. He had been a prisoner, sacrificing his whole life to protect me. I reread the diary entries, the ink blurring from the tears that wouldn't stop. He had a whole life before her, a life with another woman, a woman he loved, who was my real mother, Lydia Vance. The betrayal of my father was the beginning, but the constant lies, the years of making me feel worthless, that was my mother's true masterpiece of cruelty. I knew I couldn't face them yet, not with the raw emotion that was tearing me apart. So I called the one person I thought I could trust, my Uncle Arthur Hayes. He was my mother's brother, but I always felt like he was different, a little kinder, more honest. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the coffee is always hot, and the apathetic waitresses don't judge you for showing up at 8 a.m., looking like you've been hit by a truck. He saw the look on my face, the red eyes, and he knew. "Wyatt," he said, his voice soft. "What is it?" I didn't say a word. I just slid the diary across the table. He picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. As he read the first few entries, his face turned from confusion to shock, then to a deep, heartbreaking sadness. When he looked up, his eyes were full of tears. "Oh my God," he whispered. I had no idea. I had no idea she was capable of this. He explained to me that my mother, Genevieve, had always been obsessed with my father. He was a man of immense wealth and power, but he was also a man of honor. He had a successful real estate business, but he also had a deep love for art and for a woman named Lydia Vance. Genevieve had been his business partner, and she had fallen in love with him, but he had rejected her, and she had become a woman scorned. She was a monster, he said. She was a master manipulator. She had my father's assets. She had his family's money. She had it all. But she didn't have his love. So she took the one thing she knew he loved more than anything else, his son. My father had no legal recourse. He couldn't fight her. He had a family to protect. He had to give up his life, his business, his passion, just to keep me safe. It was the ultimate act of sacrifice. I sat there, listening to my uncle, and a new wave of emotions washed over me. It wasn't just anger or sadness anymore. It was a kind of morbid curiosity. I needed to know everything. I needed to know what had happened to my real mother, Lydia Vance. My uncle helped me. He had a small private investigator firm on the side, and he had been doing some digging into my mother's past. He found her. She was a potter. She had a small shop in town, a place I must have driven by 1,000 times. He told me that she had been living a quiet life, a life of immense sadness. She had been searching for me for years, But she had always been a step behind. She had no money, no power, and she couldn't fight Genevieve. My mother, Genevieve, had made sure of that. I drove to her shop, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw her through the window, a woman with kind eyes and a face that was etched with a profound sadness. She was working on a pottery wheel, her hands covered in clay, her face concentrated. I walked inside, and the small bell above the door jingled. She looked up, and her eyes, so full of sadness, met mine. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm looking for Lydia Vance." I said, "I'm Wyatt. I'm your son." Her face went pale. She dropped the clay she was holding, and it fell to the floor, shattering into a million pieces. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. My son. She walked over to me, her hands trembling, and she just touched my face. "I've been looking for you for so long. I've been waiting for you." We talked for hours. She told me about my father, about the man who loved her more than anything in the world. She told me about the night he had found out about my mother's plan. He had been so scared that she would hurt us. So he had done the only thing he could do. He had given up his life to protect us. She showed me a small box of photos, of a young couple laughing, of a small baby with big eyes. Me, I was a part of something, a part of a real family, and I had been taken from them. I looked at the photos, the faces of my real parents, and I knew that I had to do something. I had to get justice. I had to get my life back. I left her shop that day with a new purpose. I had a new family. I had a new past. And I was going to get a new future. I was going to fight for my father. I was going to fight for my mother. I was going to fight for myself. I was going to expose my mother, Genevieve, for the monster she was. I was going to take back what was mine. I was going to fight for justice. I was going to fight for the truth. I was going to fight for everything they had stolen from me. The $18 million they had stolen was just a number. The truth was priceless. I was going to find it. I was going to find myself. I was going to find my place in the world. I was going to find peace. I was going to find a new life. A life of my own choosing. A life of my own making. A life of my own. Getting to know Lydia was like discovering a part of myself I never knew was missing. We sat for hours in her pottery studio, the air smelling of clay and hope, and she filled in all the blanks. She told me stories about my father, Elias, the man she loved with all her heart. He was a brilliant artist and a compassionate man who had been trapped in a world of greed and ambition. She showed me pictures of him, a younger version of the man I'd found in the diary. He was laughing, his eyes full of life, and I felt a pang of sadness for the life he had lost. She told me about their plans for a small farm, a place where they could live simply and raise me. But my mother, Genevieve, had found out about me, and she had done the unthinkable. She had manipulated my father, convinced him to sell his business to her for a single dollar, and then she had used her wealth and power to get me. Lydia told me that she had fought back, but she was a simple woman with no money and no power. She had tried to get me back, but every time she got close, Genevieve would shut her down. She had been left with nothing but a broken heart and a lifetime of regret. But she had never given up hope. She had always believed that one day I would find her. She had been a ghost in her own life, a woman who had lost her son, but she had never stopped fighting. And as I sat there, listening to her story, I knew that I had to do something. I had to get justice. I had to get my life back. I left her studio that day with a new sense of purpose. I had a new family. I had a new past. And I was going to get a new future. I was going to fight for my father. I was going to fight for my mother. I was going to fight for myself. I called my uncle, Arthur, and I told him everything. He was a lawyer, and he knew what we had to do. He had been a silent witness to my mother's cruelty for years, and he was ready to help me. He had a file on my mother, a file filled with documents, photos, and a long list of her manipulative and illegal activities. He had been waiting for me. He had been waiting for the day I would be ready to fight back. We started with a lawsuit, a civil suit against my mother's estate, claiming that she had stolen my father's business and my inheritance. We also filed a police report accusing her of fraud, coercion, and emotional abuse. My brothers, Graham and Dean, were furious. They hired the best lawyers money could buy, and they launched a smear campaign against me. They called me a liar, a gold digger, a disgruntled heir who was trying to ruin their family name. They even went on national television, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart. But I didn't care. I had the truth on my side. The trial was a circus. The media was all over it. The Sinclair family feud. The $18 million betrayal. The lost heir. My brothers and their lawyers tried everything they could to discredit me. They brought up my past, my love for woodworking, my disappointing career choices. They tried to paint me as a lazy, unmotivated man who was only interested in money. But my uncle was a master. He had every document, every photo, every piece of evidence we needed. He had my father's diary, a personal account of my mother's betrayal. He had a sworn affidavit from my mother, Lydia, a heartbreaking account of her life and her loss. And he had a sworn affidavit from himself, a statement of a man who had been a silent witness to a lifetime of cruelty. When I took the stand, I told the whole story. I didn't hold anything back. I told them about my lonely childhood, about my mother's coldness, about the way my brothers had always looked down on me. I told them about my father's love, about his sacrifice, about his dying wish for me to find the truth. I told them about the locked chest and the diary inside. I told them about the truth I had found, the truth that had set me free. My brothers looked at me with a mixture of shock and anger. They had been so sure they were going to win. They had been so sure that I was nothing. But I was everything. I was the truth. The jury was out for only 2 hours. They came back with a verdict that changed my life. They found in my favor. They awarded me all of my father's assets, including the $18 million that my mother had stolen. They also awarded me punitive damages for the years of emotional abuse and suffering. My brothers were stunned. They looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and hatred. They had lost everything. The empire that they had spent their lives building was gone. My mother's legacy was in ruins. She had been a thief. She had been a liar. She had been a betrayer of the highest order. She had stolen a life from me, and she had paid the price. I was no longer a victim. I was a man who had fought for his life and had won. I used the money to build a new life. I started my own business, a furniture company that specializes in handcrafted, custom-made pieces. I also started a foundation in my father's name, a foundation that helps young artists and woodworkers get the education and resources they need to pursue their passion. I am finally at peace. I have a family now. A real family. I have a mother who loves me more than anything in the world. And I have a purpose. I am no longer a ghost in my own life. I am a man who has found his voice. A man who has found his purpose. A man who has found himself. The locked chest that my mother left me was her final act of cruelty, but it was also my salvation. It was the key to my past, my present, and my future. It was the key to my life, and that's my story. It's a story about family, betrayal, and finding your own way. I hope it spoke to you, because stories like this can happen to anyone. If you've ever felt like your own family has betrayed you, leave a comment below and tell me your story. It's important to know you're not alone. I'm here to tell the stories that need to be heard. The stories of people who have been through the fire and come out stronger. So if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that will move you, inspire you, and make you feel like you're not alone, hit that subscribe button right now. And don't forget to like this video, because every like helps me share these important stories with more people. I'm Wyatt, and I'm here to tell the truth.